Chapter 5. Maddie sat at her desk as the morning light crept through her window. Her elbows were resting on her desk, and her face rested in her hands. She thought about Ultratrans Corporation and how much she'd missed some of the people who worked here. 10 months was a long time, and she had made some really good friends like Sarah and Mr. Knotts. But this wasn't her real life, and she knew she had to move on, so she was starting to get a little anxious for this job to be over. Maddie planned to take some time off and relax at home in Oklahoma. She was anxious to spend time with her brother, and she was also supposed to go through some intensive training at her corporate office. She was going to learn about some new great technology, and that excited her. She could pretend she was a spy or something. Suddenly, Mr. Lawrence flew into the office, rambling about he needed his reports for the morning meeting. Maddie stood and straightened her skirt. She followed him into his office with the reports in her hands as he sorted frantically through the papers on his desk. "Shit, I'm going to be late. I can never find a damn thing on this desk. Jewel, please clean up this mess while I'm out this morning," he yelled. He looked up and saw the papers in her hands. Embarrassed, he nodded and grinned. "Sorry, it's going to be a bad day. I can tell already." "You'll never know just how bad, you dumb son of a bitch," Maddie thought. "This world will be a better place without you anyway." She handed him the papers. "Now remember what we talked about on these numbers, Mr. Lawson." "Yes, Joel, I remember. I'm the boss here, not you," he snapped. "I'll handle this," he barked as he stormed out of his office. "Yeah, you'll handle it all right," she muttered quietly. She stood there a few moments, enjoying the view of the bay and the early morning sun. Slowly she began clearing and straightening his desk. "What a pig," she thought. When she finished, it was time to walk to the kitchen for a fresh cup of coffee. A couple of ladies were talking openly about Mr. Lawson. "John is going to take me out tonight, Betty. I'm just too excited. He's so handsome. I can't wait to get him in the bedroom." "Jennifer, do you really think that's a good idea? I mean, remember what happened in D.C. You don't want that happening to you, too." "Hey, anyone can disappear. Anyway, no one, not even the police, officially charged him with a thing." "Just be careful, Jennifer. Be really careful." "Oh, I will, Betty. You can count on that." Maddie could not believe her ears. Don't these ladies ever learn a thing? Or are they just so hard up that they'll stoop to any level to get a man they think is of their dreams? Maddie thought of Jake, and how she still felt married to him even after all these years. Shaking her head, she picked up her cup and walked back to her office. Sipping her coffee, she admired the view from the window. These quiet moments were a real pleasure, and gave her time to reflect and catch her thoughts. The sun was bright, and there was not a cloud in the sky. 3 small sailboats were floating on the bay, with birds flying overhead. The Chicago skyline could be seen on the other side, and made a beautiful reflection on the water. Ultratrans was at the far western end of the bay, where the country met the city. Whether you turned left or right out of the parking lot determined whether you ended up in the country or you ended up in the city. Both were only a few miles away. It was beautiful here, pine trees everywhere and wildlife in abundance. Noon approached, and Maddie called Sarah on the intercom. "Ready for lunch, young lady? I'll meet you out front in 10 minutes. Maddie hung up the phone and reached for her purse. Along with the brown bag that was hiding in the back of her drawer, she then proceeded to head to the front of the building to meet Sarah and the others, who were going to the sushi bar for lunch. There were 5 girls going to lunch today: Maddie, Sarah, Leslie, Martha, Marty, and Beth. They were the outcasts of the company. Leslie and Marty worked in the accounting division, and Beth worked in personnel. They enjoyed their monthly luncheon dates very much. It gave them time to catch up on the office gossip and general chit-chat. They especially enjoyed their get-togethers now that Maddie had been promoted onto the corporate executive floor. Many great stories could be told about all the ladies working there, mostly about those very conceited and snobbish secretaries. Over lunch, Maddie told the girls what she had overheard while getting her coffee that morning. I'll bet she's trying to get pregnant, Beth stated. That's how most of them get married to these rich guys anyway. I know, Marty interjected. Who'd marry them? They're all such prudes. Shit, they think their asses don't stink, Sarah was happy to add. Mattie giggled at the comment. They are a different group. I say good morning every day and they ignore me. I might as well talk to the walls or the coffee pot. At least Mr. Knotts acknowledges me. Mr. Lawson never says good morning. He only nods. Now he is a story, Beth added. He's been in trouble in 3 different states. Oh? The girls asked. Like how? Marty asked. Well, Beth said, lowering her voice, in D.C. he was dating a girl who disappeared. They still haven't found her. And in California and New York he was accused of raping some office secretaries. The company paid those 2 girls over $2 million so they wouldn't sue, and to keep their mouths shut. It's all in the files. She smiled and sat back, feeling important, knowing this stuff, and being able to share it. What a jerk, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. Well, what goes around comes around. Someday that Mr. Lawson will get his, Leslie predicted. That's what they say. Who's they? Mattie asked. Don't know, but that's what they say, Leslie grinned. They all smiled, knowing that the secrets and stories they shared during lunch would always remain theirs and no one else's. Each girl swore to protect the others, no matter what. Each girl had a past filled with hurt and sorrow. Together they made that sorrow vanish, if even for an hour each month. Hey, did Jewel tell you she applied for a job in Florida? Sarah announced. What? The others looked concerned that a friend would soon be leaving. Check, please, waiter, Mattie said to change the subject. Oh, and don't forget my takeout. Hey, Jewel, put some poison in it, Sarah whispered. Get a grip, Sarah. He may be a jerk, but I'm not going to kill him. Really? They all laughed as they walked from the restaurant with Mr. Lawson's lunch. Mattie and Sarah rode back together. Mattie dropped Sarah off at the front entrance and continued on alone to park the car. She pulled away from the other cars and parked near the side door. Mr. Lawson's lunch was in a bag in the back seat. It was various raw fish in neat little rows. Mattie put on the latex gloves she always carried in her purse and carefully took out the puffer fish. She opened the package and used the long tweezers to break off a small piece. She gently pushed it into one of the raw fish rolls. Other small pieces of the puffer fish were placed in about 3 more rolls. We don't want to overdo it, she thought. The poison's guaranteed to be in this package. She took a quick glance around the parking lot and placed the tweezers and the remainder of the fish back in the paper bag along with the gloves, and slid the bag under her seat. With the take-out carton closed and placed back into the original bag, she laid the sauces and napkins on top. The chopsticks were dropped in, and the bag was neatly folded shut. Mattie grabbed her purse and keys and locked the car. She walked to the side entrance. She knew the camera didn't film that side of the parking lot. If people paid attention to security, they'd realize how much was lacking, she mused. Using her badge, she entered the side door. She didn't give this much thought because she often used this entrance after lunch because it was closer to her office. The back elevator was empty, and she pushed the button for the executive floor. As the doors opened and she exited the elevator, she ran directly into Mr. Knox. Well, hello there, young lady. What do we have with us today? Mr. Knox was such a nice man. Oh, Mr. Lawson's lunch. He'd buy if I'd fly, she giggled. Must be sushi. It's the only lunch I know of that John would spring for. Right you are. I don't like it myself. I always buy the cooked stuff. Well, you're obviously done with the meeting, so I'd better get in there. You know how he is. Indeed I do. Mr. Knotts entered the elevator and the doors closed. Mattie walked into her office and put down her purse. The door to Mr. Lawson's office was only a few feet away. As she entered, the bag swung in her hands. He saw it, and his mouth was already watering as he hung up the phone. Mattie handed him the bag, and he removed the carton of raw fish. He smiled at her. Here, he said, let's hit the Do Not Disturb button on your phone. And here's your channel changer. You can watch the news while you eat. "You are a jewel, Jewel." John Lawson settled down to enjoy his raw fish and the noon news. Maddie walked to his outer door and pushed the lock button. She then walked through their connecting door and locked her outside door. She left their connecting door open. She didn't want to miss a thing. He could hear the sound of her nails clicking on the keyboard as he flipped through the channels. He loved sushi. It was his favorite meal. In some ways, it's better than sex, he thought. Well, maybe not, but close. His mouth was watering just looking at it. He clicked through the channels until he found the local news and popped the top of his soda can. "Thanks again, Jewel," he shouted from his desk. "No problem, Mr. Lawson," he heard her say from the other room. He began eating, savoring every bite. "God, this is good," he said loudly, almost shouting. There were about 4 rolls left when suddenly something felt funny. Something was not right. He picked up his soda and took a drink. Something was definitely wrong. His tongue tingled. He swished his tongue back and forth and took another drink. It didn't want to go down, and he choked a little. He leaned forward, and the soda dripped from his mouth onto the uneaten sushi. His throat was going numb. What the hell, he thought? When John Lawson realized that the tingling sensation was going down his neck and into his chest, panic set in. "Oh, my God!" He tried to cry out, but his vocal cords were numb. He realized what was happening. He had seen it before in China. There must be some bad fish in this stuff. He knew he was going to die if he didn't get some help. He grabbed the phone and pushed the intercom, but Jewel wasn't responding. He pushed another button, any button, but nothing happened. Ah, shit. He remembered that the phones had been transferred to Jewel's phones. He could only call her. Oh, fuck. He stood, but barely. He dropped the phone. He knew he had to get to Jewel. He tried to walk, but could only take a couple of steps. He fell to the floor. His body was going numb. The tingling feeling was continuing down through his body and was now at his stomach. It was getting harder to breathe, very hard. He could hear and see everything, but couldn't move a muscle. He was frantic, repeating the word, fuck, 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 over and over in his head. He knew he was done for. He'd been warned about eating raw fish, but had never given it much thought. Fuck, this is it. It wasn't very long before Maddie heard a commotion coming from Mr. Lawson's office. She stood and walked over to the connecting doors. Mr. Lawson was on the floor in front of his desk. He wasn't moving. She walked over and slowly hung up his phone. Then she took the phone off Do Not Disturb and walked over to where Mr. Lawson lay. She knelt down beside him and peered directly into his eyes. He looked desperately back at her. "God, help me," he yelled, but nothing came from his lips. He yelled again and again, "Jewel, help me, please." He could see her, and she wasn't doing anything but looking at him and smiling. Was she crazy? What in the hell was going on? Maddie bent over to his ear and whispered, "Goodbye, John. I guess we'll see each other in our next lives. Sweet dreams, Mr. Lawson. Oh, by the way, say hello to that young lady you dated in D.C. for me when you see her." John Lawson felt real fear for the first time in his life. Maddie stood and calmly walked from his room. She closed the connecting door behind her and pressed the lock button as she exited. And to think, I didn't even need my map of the cameras. This was too easy. Lawson lay very still on the floor. He could hear about the day's events from the news anchorman. His breathing was slowing down, but he was wide awake. "Oh, God, please help me," he cried. But nothing moved, not his lips, not his eyes, not his chest, absolutely nothing. His breathing became shallower and shallower until it finally stopped. He lay there feeling an increasingly desperate need for a breath of fresh air, but he could not command his body to take one. The pain of suffocation was real. He could feel it. It was the most hideous and terrifying pain that he had ever felt during his brief life. His chest burned with the desire to breathe. Breathe! Just one goddamn breath! It seemed like a lifetime, but only a few minutes had passed. He was suffocating. He knew he was dying. A few minutes passed, and Mattie walked back into the room and unlocked Mr. Lawson's outside door. She walked to her door and announced to her boss that she was going to run to the store and get him the stuff he'd requested earlier, and she'd be back in about 15 minutes. The door shut behind her. Lawson was confused, dizzy. Store? Can't she see I'm in deep trouble here? Can't she see? God help me, please. And then everything went dark. Very, very dark for poor Mr. Lawson. The little store was about 5 minutes away. The brown paper bag that held the tweezers were dropped into a trash can just outside the store. On the way there, Mattie had thrown the remainder of the puffer fish into a creek along the road. The chances of anyone finding it before the other fish did was quite slim. The gloves she would wash and put back inside the little carrier in her purse. She entered the store, bought the requested items, picked up another 6-pack of sodas from Mr. Lawson's office refrigerator, paid the clerk, and headed back to the office. Another 50 for another day. Mr. Lawson lay dead 2 steps in front of the desk. He wouldn't be found until much later that day when Mr. Knotts came by to discuss some accounting numbers. Food poisoning, everyone agreed, was a horrible way to go, but Mr. Lawson was a habitual raw fish eater, and the gossip was that it would probably happen sooner or later. Of course, no one suspected Jewel of anything. Poor Jewel. Sweet, innocent Jewel. Lucky for her, she had a new job offer lined up in Florida. Chapter 6. It had been a week since she'd resigned from Ultratrans Corporation, but Mattie had one little job to finish. Old Fart Fred lived alone, and there would be a special little surprise for him tonight. Toby was excited to be spending the evening with the neighbors one last time before the trip back to Oklahoma. The pizza had already been ordered, and the movie was playing when Mattie dropped him off. The evening was damp from the warm summer night, and there was not a cloud in the sky. The black outfit made her sweat terribly, but Mattie didn't care. Tonight was going to be fun. Tonight was Jewel's personal revenge night. She held the small jar with the holes punched in the lid as far away from her as possible. What was crawling around in the jar gave her the creeps and made her itch all over. The car lights and ignitions were turned off before the brakes squealed in front of the old house on Belmont Street. The houses were built in the early 1900s and were in dire need of repair. Mattie could tell that this street had been beautiful at one time. Old Victorian homes lined the street that once was full of color from all the different homes with neatly trimmed yards, but now the roofs were rotting and the shrubs were overgrown or dying. The eaves of all the houses needed a good coat of paint, and some of the shutters had long since fallen to the ground, where no one cared to pick them up. Trash lined the street, and old cars that no longer ran were parked in driveways or yards of some of the houses. What a shame, Mattie thought. This could still be a beautiful area if people would just take care of what they have. As she walked to the rear of 1842 Belmont Street, several cats scattered through the yard with a screech that made her jump. The lights were off, but a television could be heard blaring from inside. Good, he's home, just as planned. The back door was entered via several rotten steps and was wide open, as it had been the last few weeks. The only light was from the television in the living room at the front of the house. The linoleum in the kitchen had long since faded, and the original floorboards showed through large holes from where the linoleum had ripped. There were rust stains in the sink from years of a dripping faucet. Dirty dishes were stacked in the sink, and dried food caked the stove and small kitchen table. 2 glass doors led to the other rooms on the right, but Mattie didn't know or care to know where they went or what was behind them. What she was after was sitting in the living room. The light from the television cast an eerie, ever-changing shadow onto the short hallway leading from the kitchen into the living room. The stench of filth filled Mattie's nose and revolted her. She hated that smell. Rotten old food and dust. She walked slowly into the living room, and the grunting sounds of a man snoring gave Mattie a feeling of delight. Great, He must be in his drunken stupor. Fred was out cold in an old dirty red velvet recliner, arms dangling over the arms of the chair, his head leaning to one side. On the floor next to the chair were several empty whiskey bottles. It's obviously easier to drop things where one finishes them than to find a trash can, she commented to herself. Dirty clothes were scattered around the room, and old newspapers were everywhere. Old cracked and yellow shades were pulled down over the front windows, and the old floor rug was in need of a good vacuuming. The tables needed soap and water, for they were way beyond the dusting stage. From where she stood, Mattie could see the front door and the old wooden stairs leading to the second floor. This had been a beautiful home at one time, she thought. The faded and torn wallpaper still had a little luster left in it, and proudly displayed its beauty in the corners where the sunlight never shone. Cobwebs with tons of dust hung from the light fixtures in various places around the room. Mattie was ready to leave at any time. This man was a pig at the office and a pig at home. Filth. This man lived in filth. As she walked toward the sleeping old fart, Mattie could see where he had drooled on his chest. Since today was Saturday, it was apparent that he had not bathed nor shaved since Friday morning. "Disgusting," she whispered. She was holding the jar in her extended hand. The small spiders were climbing over one another in attempts of escape. The jar gave her the jitters, and while driving she had kept one eye on the road and the other on the jar. The idea of jumping from a moving car seemed more logical than remaining if the spiders escaped. The thought of taking off the lid and having to hold the jar was not something that appealed to her. As Fred snored in his drunken slumber, Mattie remembered how his breath always had the lingering odor of alcohol. It was not hard to deduce that the man obviously drank himself to sleep every night. Several of her evenings during the last few weeks had been spent standing outside his home and watching his evening rituals. Home by 7, and a bottle of whiskey for dinner, asleep and dead to the world by 9. This she had tested by either calling his house from a nearby payphone or ringing the doorbell and not getting an answer. Even pounding on the door didn't budge the man. Mattie lightly shook the jar and watched as the spiders with the red hourglass design settled on the bottom. There were about 30 angry little ladies entwined on each other. 1 or 2 had been eaten, and what remained of their carcasses lay lifeless on the jar's bottom. Their legs were unable to hold onto the glass sides, and they fell on top of one another as they tried to escape. She looked into the jar to make sure none were hanging from the lid, then gently unscrewed the top. Removing the lid gave Mattie an eerie sensation. She was not enjoying this part one little bit, even though she wore rubber gloves. She held the lid in her left hand, and with her right hand shook the little black spiders from the jar onto Fred's head. She stepped back, looking into the jar to make sure none were left behind. She shivered to think of having those ugly little black things on her. Once in a drunken slumber, a person does not move much, and Mattie had counted on this. She only needed one to take a bite. The spiders were angry and had wanted their freedom. They began to move and soon realized they had escaped, and a few began to scurry about. Mattie was done. Now it was all up to them. The beautiful little black spiders began to crawl around on Fred's balding head and onto his shoulders. One was now on his forehead, and another was squirming in his ear. His t-shirt and boxer shorts were his only defense from those venomous little creatures. They scattered freely about, some going straight for his few strands of hair, while others ran down his neck or fell onto his boxers. Mattie noticed one scrambling under his shorts into his groin area, and she wondered if they had the ability to smell. She knew her job here was finished. She turned and almost ran out the back door. She tossed the jar across the yard, but the lid she kept, for it had holes in it. After one last look, she turned and through the open door saw Fred use his hand to rub something away from his cheek. He was still asleep, and he never felt a thing as a few of the spiders bit deeply into his flesh, releasing their deadly toxin. Whether or not the venom killed or just made him sick was none of Maddie's concern. The thought that Fred would be a very sorry man for the next few days made her feel great. He had made her life miserable for almost a year, and she simply wanted to return the favor. If by chance Fred did not make it through this ordeal, then the world would be free of one less drunk and useless person. She didn't find that too hard to accept. Maddie drove away, feeling as though little creatures were crawling all over her. She scratched her head, legs, and arms all the way home. Toby was not picked up until Maddie had showered and changed her clothes. "Tomorrow it's Oklahoma and we're going home," Maddie said, as she watched Toby fall asleep in her arms later that night.